All right, welcome back to school after our long break here in U.S. history. Today we're going to start talking about Chapter 7, which deals with the American Revolution, where over the course of the chapter we're going to be able to organize events of the Revolution in a chronological sequence, and we'll take a look at the different causes that led to an American victory eventually. Sorry to spoil the surprise for you, but hopefully you knew we won. So today we're going to take a look at the early years of the war. And I'm going to read you one American story on this man here, Haym Salomon. But he was a man who was in search of liberty and freedom, and he moved from Eastern Europe to America sometime between 1764 and 1775. He was a Jew from Poland who arrived in New York City, and Salomon soon became a very successful merchant and banker. After the war broke out, Salomon supported the Patriot cause. When the British captured New York in 1776, many patriots fled, but Salomon stayed. The British arrested him as a spy. He spoke many languages, and the British thought he could help their supply officers deal with foreign merchants, so they let him out of prison. But he used this opportunity to help other prisoners escape. In 1778, the British wanted to arrest Salomon again, so he fled to Philadelphia. His earlier time in the cold, damp prison had permanently damaged his health, but even so, he continued to aid the Patriots. He loaned the new government more than $600,000, which was never repaid. Like Salomon, many people made hard choices about which side to support during the Revolutionary War. And in this section, we'll discuss those choices and the obstacles Americans faced in the war's early years. So today, by the time you're done with this section, you can describe colonial options on American independence. You'll be able to explain the importance of the mid-Atlantic coastal cities. You will also be able to analyze early British strategy, and you will be able to summarize the causes and effects of the battles of Saratoga. So, the issue of separating from Great Britain really divided Americans quite terribly, actually. Opinion polls did not exist in the 1700s, so we don't exactly know how many people were on each side, but historians estimate that roughly 20 to 30% of Americans were loyalists, and roughly 40 to 45% were patriots. That meant that about 25 to 40% were neutral. So therefore, most Americans did not support the revolution. They were either loyalists or they were neutral, meaning they didn't care either way, really. So both patriots and loyalists came from all walks of life, and they came from all over the American colonies. In general, New England and Virginia had high numbers of patriots. You can find lots of loyalists in cities, in New York State, and in the South. Many loyalists worked for the British government, or they were in clergy in the Church of England. Some Quakers were loyalists, although many wanted peace because their faith taught them that war was wrong. The war actually divided Native Americans too. The Iroquois nation fought with the British and others with the Americans. Those Native Americans who joined the British feared that if the Americans won, they would take Native American land. Some Native Americans who lived near colonists and interacted with them did side with the Americans, so we had them on both sides. African Americans fought on both sides. At first, slave owners feared that African Americans who had guns might lead slave revolts. Therefore, very few states allowed African Americans to enlist or sign up with the army. Then a British governor offered freedom to any enslaved person who joined the British army, so lots of slaves ran away to fight for the British. So in response to that, most states began to accept African American soldiers, and in all, about 5,000 African Americans served in the Continental Army. A lot of African Americans who did so thought American independence would bring greater equality. So we even found differences over the war that split families. For example, Benjamin Franklin, a man we've talked about quite a bit, his son William took Britain's side, and the father and son stopped speaking altogether. Now, when it came to creating an army, raising the army was very difficult. The Army was also faced with other problems. In June of 1775, George Washington became the commander of the Continental Army, and at first this new national army was formed from state militias that were made up of untrained and undisciplined volunteers. Sorry about all the notes here, I know it's going to be a long one. After Congress created the Continental Army, men began to enlist, but most of them didn't stay very long. At the start of the war, Congress asked men to enlist only for 1 year. Later, Congress did lengthen the term of service. When the soldiers' time was up, they went home. So as a result, Washington's army never numbered more than 17,000 men. This made things also very difficult for Washington, because it would be like if you were part of a sports team if you only practiced for 4 or 5 months with each other, and right when you got good, you went home, and the coach had to start over with new people every 4 or 5 months. That'd be very difficult. So kind of think of it in that terms, whether you're doing sports or a choir or a band or whatever. A 1 year period is not long enough to really get anywhere. So after Congress created the Continental Army, men began to enlist. Sorry, I already went over that part. But Congress's inability to supply the Army also frustrated Washington. The soldiers needed everything: blankets, shoes, food, and even guns and ammunition. So Washington became pretty angry, and he actually wrote, "Could I have foreseen what I have, and am likely to experience, no consideration upon earth should have persuaded me to accept this command." There were lots of women who did try to help the Army. Martha Washington and other wives followed their husbands to Army camps. The women cooked, they did laundry, they nursed the sick or wounded soldiers. A few women even helped fight. A lady by the name of Mary Hayes earned the nickname Molly Pitcher by carrying water to tired soldiers during a battle. Deborah Sampson, dressed as a man, she enlisted and fought in several different engagements. Building an army was very crucial to Washington's plan. To the British, the Americans were disorganized, inexperienced rebels. The British thought that if they won a decisive battle, the Americans would give up. By contrast, Washington's main goal was to survive. To do so, he needed to keep an army in the field, win some battles no matter how small, and avoid a crushing defeat. He knew he could not hope to win a major battle until he had a large, well-equipped army. As Chapter 6 explained, Washington had forced the British to retreat from Boston in March of 1776 with the cannons around the upper parts of Boston. So Washington then hurried his army to New York City, where he expected the British to go next. One British goal was to occupy coastal cities so that their navy could land troops and supplies in those cities. From there, they could launch their military campaigns. Washington was right. In July of 1776, Britain's General William Howe, who you see here on the right, he arrived in New York with a very, very large army. Then in August, more soldiers arrived, including about 9,000 Hessian mercenaries. By definition, a mercenary is a professional soldier that's hired to fight for a foreign country. British soldiers, when they would sign up, they usually had to sign up for life, which discouraged a lot of enlistment in Britain. So the British needed mercenaries whom they hired from the German states. So for several months, the British and the American armies fought for New York State, and finally the British forced Washington to retreat through New Jersey. By December, when the American army crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, it was in terrible shape. Charles Willson Peale was a Philadelphia painter who watched the crossing. He saw one muddy soldier who had lost all his clothes. He was in an old dirty blanket jacket, his beard long and his face so full of sores he could not clean it. To Peale's shock, the soldier called his name, and it was actually Peale's brother. Also at the time, political writer Thomas Paine, who we've talked about in previous chapters, he also was very apparent, and he was visible. He was out and around, documenting what was going on. And he witnessed the very hard conditions, the soldiers' low spirits on the retreat. So to urge him to keep fighting, Paine published the first in a series of pamphlets called The American Crisis, which was designed to urge the troops to keep fighting. And he said, quote, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." So Washington hoped a victory would encourage his weary men. He also knew that he had to attack the British quickly because most of his soldiers would leave once their enlistments ended on December 31st. So late on December 25th, 1776, Washington concocted this awesome plan. That's actually kind of funny. But his troops rode across the icy Delaware River back into New Jersey to the town of Trenton, where they marched in bitter early morning cold to surprise the Hessians, some of whom were sleeping off their Christmas celebration. The Americans captured or killed more than 900 Hessians and gained needed supplies. Washington's army actually won another victory at Princeton 8 days later, and these victories proved that the American general was better than the British had thought. This also helped the American army attract new recruits. But back to the plan in the Battle of Trenton. The German celebration had consisted of very heavy drinking and lots of card playing. They had gone to sleep only a couple of hours before Washington reached Trenton, which was about 6:30 a.m. The German commander barely had time to dress himself and order his troops into battle. But the Americans had already taken over a number of houses in Trenton. They dried their rifles and positioned themselves at windows in the homes. The German commander fell mortally wounded, and the Germans surrendered, and the fighting was over by 9:30 a.m. So it only took them 3 hours to do all this. Now, when it comes to the strategy, the British were pursuing a strategy or an overall plan of action to seize the Hudson River Valley. If successful, they could cut off New England from the other states. So the strategy called for 3 armies to meet or rendezvous at Albany, New York. General John Burgoyne would lead a force south from Canada. Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Leger would lead his army from Lake Ontario down the Mohawk Valley, and Burgoyne expected General Howe to follow the Hudson River north from New York City. This didn't exactly go to plan. But Burgoyne left Canada in June of 1777 with an army that included British, Hessians, and Iroquois, and in July they captured Fort Ticonderoga. He was known as Gentleman Johnny to his soldiers, but Burgoyne enjoyed traveling slowly and throwing very large parties to celebrate victories. This man had what was it, like 140 artillery pieces, 30 wagons that were full of his personal belongings, wines, and the wardrobe of his girlfriend. So he definitely loved him, I guess you could say. But after Fort Ticonderoga, his delays gave the Americans time to cut down trees and block his route south. They also burned off crops and drove off cattle, which left the countryside bare of any supplies for British troops that they would eventually need. So things grew even more tough during the last 25 miles of Burgoyne's march to Albany. On a map, the route looked pretty easy, but when they got there, they found that it crossed through swampy wilderness, and the army had to build bridges and roads. Burgoyne took 4 weeks to reach the Hudson, and still confident, he looked forward to this rendezvous with St. Leger and Howe in Albany. But that didn't exactly happen. On August 4th, Burgoyne received a message from General Howe that said that he would not be coming north because he had decided to invade Pennsylvania to try to capture General Washington in Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress met. "Success be ever with you," wrote Howe. Yet Burgoyne needed Howe's soldiers, not his good wishes. Howe actually did invade Pennsylvania, and in September of 1777 he did defeat Washington, although he was not able to capture him at the Battle of Brandywine. Howe then occupied Philadelphia. So in October, Washington attacked Howe at Germantown. Washington lost the battle, however, and he did retreat. Now, as Burgoyne received Howe's message, St. Leger had his own issues out in Albany, or on getting to Albany. In the summer of 1777, he was trying to defeat a small American force at Fort Stanwix in the Mohawk River Valley of New York. St. Leger's forces included Iroquois led by Mohawk chief Joseph Brant, who was also known as Tyandagi. Brant and his sister Molly had strong ties to the British. Molly was a British official's wife, and Joseph was a convert to the Church of England. Both Joseph and Molly tried to convince the Iroquois to fight for the British, who upheld Iroquois rights to their land. But the problem was, during August of 1777, American General Benedict Arnold led a small army up the Mohawk River. He wanted to chase the British away from Fort Stanwix. Arnold sent a captured loyalist and some Iroquois who were American allies to spread the rumor that he had a large army, and the trick worked. St. Leger's troops were afraid they were about to be outnumbered, so the army retreated so fast that it left behind tents, cannon, and supplies. Because of St. Leger's flight and Howe's refusal to follow the strategy, no one was left to rendezvous with Burgoyne, and this is going to create a large problem for Gentleman Johnny. Now, by this time, Burgoyne's army was running very low on supplies, and they needed horses. So the general sent a raiding party into Vermont to see what it could find. The raiding party encountered New England troops who badly defeated at the Battle of Bennington on August 16, 1777. Despite this setback, Burgoyne's army headed slowly toward Albany. On the way, they met a powerful Continental Army force led by General Horatio Gates. Gates's soldiers were waiting on a ridge called Bemis Heights near Saratoga, New York. There, the Americans had created fortifications or built up earthen walls behind which to fight, which they learned how to do from a Polish engineer named Tadeusz Kuszko. And he had helped the Americans build all these fortifications. So Burgoyne would have to break through the fortifications and proceed to Albany, and on September 19th he attacked. While Gates commanded the Americans on the ridge, Benedict Arnold led an attack on nearby Freeman's Farm. His men repeatedly charged the British and inflicted heavy casualties, but still the British held their position. On October 7th, another battle broke out. Again, Arnold led daring charges against the British. Although hundreds of muskets were firing at him, he galloped through the battlefield like a madman, a sergeant later said. Frightened, Burgoyne's Hessian mercenaries began to fall back, and eventually a bullet tore into Arnold's leg and stopped him, but even so, the Americans did force Burgoyne to retreat. Burgoyne's army moved very slowly through heavy rain to a former army camp at Saratoga. By the time they arrived, the men were exhausted. Some of them fell in the mud and slept in their wet uniforms. The Continental Army then surrounded Burgoyne's army and fired on it day and night without stopping. Burgoyne decided to surrender, and the series of conflicts that led to this surrender were known as the Battles of Saratoga. Now, the Battles of Saratoga had two very different consequences. As Benedict Arnold was recovering from his wound, he married a woman who was a loyalist. Over time, Arnold came to feel that Congress had not rewarded him enough for his heroic actions at Saratoga and other battles, so influenced by his bitterness and his wife, he betrayed his army. In 1780, he agreed to turn over an American fort to the British, and although his plot was discovered before he could carry it out, he did escape. So even today, if you're called a Benedict Arnold, that means that you are a traitor or you're a backstabber. So on the positive side, the victory at Saratoga was a turning point in the Revolution because it caused other European nations to think that the Americans might win their war for independence. So in our next section, Section 2, which we'll talk about on Monday, several European nations decided to start helping the Americans in their struggle, which really helped turn the tide of the war.